highlight experts here on the campus of Michigan State University around topics that cross multiple disciplines and engage in intellectual discussion and hopefully create an opportunity for you to ask questions as well. Today we're going to be looking at brain, mind, and soul, locating the human. And we are very pleased that we have several co-sponsors. This is an Honors College initiative, but Lyman Briggs College, Cognitive Science Program, the Neuroscience Program, the Departments of Philosophy, Psychology, and Religious Studies, as well as the Center for Ethics and Humanities and the Life Sciences all came together to co-sponsor this program, showing just how important it is for us to work across disciplines. And before I introduce the panelists, I do want to introduce, at least one of them is going to be hiding in the back, but introduce two people instrumental in pulling the panel together. One is John Beck, out of Labor and Industrial Relations. John is serving in the role as an honors professor consultant, and in that role he helps to organize the panels and find the faculty and brainstorm the topics and pretty much make everything work with this series. So we're very indebted to John. And here in front we have Joyce Samuel, who's an academic specialist in the Honors College. And Joyce makes sure all the logistics come together so that you can have a good experience. So this evening, we're going to hear from Dr. Mark Breedlove, who is the Barnett Rosenberg Professor of Neuroscience, and he has appointments in neuroscience, psychology, and zoology. And he's a fellow in the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and his research interests deal with developing an adult nervous system. And he also looks at the effect of steroid hormones on the developing adult nervous system, including sexual differentiation of the developing brain and spinal cord. And Dr. Breedlove is immediately to my right, and he will be our first speaker this evening. We also have Dr. Devin McCauley, who's an associate professor of psychology and the director of the Cognitive Science Program. And his research interests include auditory perception, attention and memory, music cognition, the relationship between music and language, and mechanisms of timing and temporal processing and cognitive neuroscience, amongst other things. And Dr. McCauley will be our second speaker this evening. Our third speaker this evening will be Dr. Jim Nelson, on my far right, professor of philosophy, and he works primarily in bioethics, but he's interested in a number of areas, including moral theory, looking at realism and anti-realism controversy, and the more speculative reaches of the philosophy of language. And we will also have, okay, let's see, Joyce is doing her job, dealing with technical difficulties to make sure we get all this. Okay, is that better? All right. And to my far left, we have Dr. Arthur Versluis, professor and chair of the Department of Religious Studies, founding president of the Association for the Study of Esotericism, and he looks at the intersection of religion and literature. The way that we're going to work tonight is that each of our panelists are going to start with a brief introduction of some ideas that they have around the brain, mind, and soul, locating the human. And after they've all done their presentation, we'll pose questions to the panelists, myself, and then open up to the floor to allow you to pose questions. And with that, I'd like to yield the floor to Dr. Breedlove.
Hi, good evening. As the neuroscientist here, there are several topics that I feel like I would like to talk to you about, things that I think you might find interesting. In the last few years, the study of consciousness has actually become respectable in neurosciences, which would have been unheard of when I was in graduate school. And there have been several findings that I think you'll find fascinating, but I also think are somewhat disquieting. So I'm partly hoping to make you a little bit uncomfortable about what you think about what you think. So I'm going to talk first about what in neuroscience we call the easy and the hard problems of consciousness, and then I'm going to talk about Spinoza's stone, which is, and the subtitle for that is My Uneasy Consciousness. So what's the easy problem of consciousness in neuroscience? It is, can we ever understand what the pattern of brain activity is that underlies a particular conscious experience. And I would say that most of the progress in that field, which has happened just in the last few decades, has been in the area of vision. So can we ever understand what's going on in the brain when someone is seeing something, right? Because for us that's such an important and salient part of our experience. We're such visual animals. So people have done experiments like this, where you put a person in an MRI scanner and you have them look at, in this first experiment I'll tell you about, they looked at a limited number of photographs. And while they were looking at the photograph, the machine was scanning brain activity and the computer was keeping track of the brain activity. And it turns out that the machine could eventually learn which pattern of brain activity was seen while the person was looking at a particular picture, so that the person could say, oh, they must be looking at the picture of the rabbit now, right? As opposed to the picture of the still life, things like that. And on the one hand, that's impressive, right? But it doesn't really give you a sense that we know much about what the scanning's showing us. A more impressive demonstration was done that same year. This is just a few years ago. Where now they have a person in a scanner and they're looking at simple objects, simple images, and using what we know about the projections from the retina to the brain, can we reconstruct what they must be seeing? And in these experiments, they were able to for example, the computer could reconstruct that the person must be seeing something that looks like a square, or in this case, a cross. And so that too is rather impressive. But the real impressive thing was just announced last week, where they really got to the point where you feel like the computer program can actually know what a person is seeing, that might be possible one day. So in these experiments, the person's head is in a scanner, and they're looking at, in this case, they had 3 highly motivated subjects, they were authors of the paper, who watched 18 million seconds of random YouTube videos, right? So think of that as, the 8th circle of hell for most people. But so they're staring at this, and while they're watching the videos, the scanner is watching the brain activity, and the computer is carefully keeping track of both the images on the screen and the brain activity. You get the idea so far? And now you have the subjects look at a YouTube video they've never seen before, and the computer is going to try to reconstruct what they're seeing. Now, this may look somewhat unimpressive here to you, but in fact, what they did was, here would be the new image that the people would see, and here are the 3 subjects, and the computer would notice the brain activity that was going on right now, and then would assemble the 100 YouTube video clips that most closely reenact the brain activity the person is having right now. You see that? And so it would take the 100 video clips where the brain activity came closest to the brain activity the person's having right now, and then it would simply average all those images to show you, to make a good guess as to what he's seeing. So here are the 3 folks. So we'll see if this works. And you'll see that as the clip is moving, you can see that this thing is reconstructing for each person. That's not bad, showing the blop, right? It gets that pretty good. You can tell when it's a human being. Here, you can't tell it's an elephant, but you can tell that something is shambling along the screen there, right? Pretty soon you're going to see an airplane in the image that they're looking at, and you'll see that for all 3 subjects at one time or other, the computer gets it. It shows a clip of from YouTube of the airplane. So, I mean, this comes pretty close to mind reading, right? Of knowing what it is the person's seeing. So you can imagine, for example, the obvious question is, when we're dreaming, are the same brain areas activated that are active when we're seeing things in real life? And if so, you might even be able to reconstruct what a person's seeing in their dreams. So in terms of the easy problem of consciousness, I think in the last few years there's been progress that nobody anticipated, how quickly it's coming, at least for vision. This, of course, brings up what's the hard problem of consciousness. Whoops, I think I'm going the wrong way, sorry about that. So the hard problem of consciousness is this. You can imagine the person's in a scanner and the computer, and we have the technology that we can tell that the person is looking at a red screen. And this woman here, she can say, well, he's looking at a red screen, I can tell that. That's the easy problem of consciousness. The hard problem is, how do we know that when this woman sees the color we all call red, she's not having the experience that other people have when they're looking at the color we call blue? That's the hard problem of consciousness. Can we ever understand what it is about neural activity that gives you that percept, right? That gives you that particular experience that you have. And we don't even know how to get at this problem, right? So that's, if you want to get a Nobel Prize, figure out how we can even get a crowbar into that problem, and I think you'll have people's attention. So but I don't have that crowbar, so I'm going to change topics. The second thing I want to talk about is the problem of confabulation and Spinoza's stone. So Spinoza was a philosopher, and he was very dubious about people's explanation for why they do the things that they do. He thought that people had free will, that in fact people can choose to do certain things, but he wasn't he was skeptical about the reasons people give for why they do what they do. And he said, you know, if someone picked up a stone and threw it, and after the stone had been thrown, if it suddenly became conscious, I'm sure it would think, I'm going along here because this is what I want to do, right? And so, you know, here's an example. Here's a stone that thinks, I really want to go look at that government tank over there. These two stones are both going to be thinking, gee, that telephone pole looks fascinating. Let's go look at that. And this stone is thinking, that guy really annoys me, right? Well, of course, this is just a fantasy, right? I mean, we can't really make stones suddenly conscious along the way of a trajectory. But there's lots of findings in neuroscience that make us uncomfortably think that our everyday existence might be not unlike Spinoza's stone. Let me give you one example. So here's one of these. Normally, when a person is looking at something in the left visual field, that information gets to the right side of the brain, it crosses the corpus callosum, gets to the left side of the brain where language areas tend to be, and the person can tell you what they saw. Oh, that's a key. But in the famous split brain individuals, if it's presented in the left visual field, it goes to the right side of the brain, but the information can't cross the corpus callosum because it's been cut. So the half of the brain that has language capability can't tell you what it was that the other half of the brain just saw, right? Whereas if you present it to the right visual field, then the information gets directly to the language area and can tell you, oh, that's a key. Well, in some of these experiments with split brain folks, there are times when their behavior makes me very uneasy. And there are times when there's confabulation going on. So, for example, in this case, they're showing the split brain person two different images at once, and one's going to one side of the brain and one to the other. The image that's going to the left side of the brain, the side that can talk, is of a chicken foot, right? And the other side, the one that's getting to the right brain, is of a snowy field. And you'd ask the person, pick the cards that match the scene. Well, the right hand that has the language, it picks a chicken. Perfectly good answer. The left hand picks a snow shovel. But now you ask the gentleman, why did you pick the snow shovel? And he'll come up with a reason. And he'll say, for example, he said, oh, that's simple. You need a shovel to clean up the chicken shed, right? Well, okay. And as far as we know, the person actually believes what he's saying about why he chose that card. It makes you kind of uneasy. Well, you'd say, well, okay, but I don't have a split brain, so I know that's not what's going on with me. Well, but there are lots of other examples. So, for example, in Korsakoff syndrome, it's a problem with memory. These individuals, they'll sometimes be in the middle of doing something, and then will forget why they're doing it. But if you ask them, they'll give you a reason, right? They'll always think up a reason. They never say, I don't know why I'm doing this. They give you a reason. Or the fascinating syndrome of hemispatial neglect. Sometimes when people have a stroke, they deny ownership of the left half of their body. So that you can say to them, isn't that your left leg that's in bed with you there in the hospital bed? And the person will say, no, that's not my left leg. Well, whose left leg do you think that? You know, I think my sister left that there. That was really careless of her, don't you think? And she seems to believe what she's saying. And there are cases of electrical stimulation where, I mean, one of my favorites, where if you stimulate parts of the brain in patients who need that for various reasons, for study, they will sometimes do things, and when you ask them why they did it, they will give you a reason, and they have no idea that they did it because they got a tiny electrical stimulation in the brain. My favorite example was a young lady who, in one spot, every time they stimulated there, she thought whatever was happening around her was funny, and she would laugh. And they would say, well, What are you laughing? Well, it's, it's so funny. You two guys standing there, you're so funny. And that kind of creeps me out. That whatever's happening around her, she will think is humorous if that particular part of the brain, and she doesn't seem to be aware that, that this is sort of a mechanical business. Well, this brings me then to this part of our consciousness that we're all so fond of, this internal dialogue, where we're constantly talking to ourselves, thinking about what we're going to say next, and we're constantly thinking about what we're going to do, and we have this feeling that we are in charge of what our body does, right? I mean, that's how it feels, I'm happy to say. But there's some experiments that suggest this may not be the case. So in these experiments, this person isn't really in a desk, he's in a scanner, but we did it this way so you could see. And you just tell him, I want you to push either the left button or the right button, and I don't care when you push it. You decide. Think about it and push either the left button or the right button. Oh, and by the way, watch the television screen where these letters of the alphabet will go by in random order, and keep track of what letter was on the screen when you decided to push that button. Everyone get the idea? So you have them, and the person pushes the button, and the letter L is up now, but he says the letter E was on when I decided to push the button on the right. The problem is the scientists in the scanner, they knew sometimes as much as 10 seconds earlier which button he was going to push. And yet he thinks that the guy who's talking to you, he thinks that he made the decision. Well, of course, and when this came out, you may have heard about it. People are talking about, well, does this suggest there's no such thing as free will? And I think that's silly. It doesn't say anything about free will, right? Of course, this gentleman chose to push the right button. It's just that a part of his brain that he doesn't have access to made the decision before the part of his brain that talks to you was aware of it. And sometimes it's several seconds before he was aware of it, which is kind of disconcerting, right? And it makes you wonder, and it really brings home Spinoza's idea that when I ask you why you did something, you'll have a reason, but it really makes you wonder whether that's really the reason, or if that's just what the part of you that's, that internal dialogue, that's what the reason that it thinks it was there. In other words, you get this uneasy feeling that me, the part of me that right now I'm aware of and that's talking to you and that I talk to myself about and I think about what I'm going to, it really makes me worry that that part of me is a Johnny-come-lately in all the decision process, right? And that maybe I should be a little bit worried about what that me tells me about why I do things. And so I would just remind you of this quote that, from Emo Phillips. I used to think that the brain was the most wonderful organ in my body, and then I realized who was telling me this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Breedlove. We're just going to switch up the laptops and then we'll be ready to go.
Okay, when I was first asked to talk in the symposium, it had such a broad title, Brain, Mind, Soul, Locating the Human. I spent some time trying to think about how some of the work that I do fits in with this broad perspective and what aspect of that work would be perhaps generate some interesting questions for discussion. So to start out, I want to, if I take locating the human literally, I can think about location of people in space, which led me to think about also that people are both in particular locations at particular times. And a lot of my work is on the experience of time. So let me use a spatial analogy to start out, just to get everyone thinking about this issue, because sometimes space is easier to think about than time. So you can imagine that you're trying to locate where we are right now using Google Earth. And so you start out very broadly, and you may sort of be in the United States and you see a map of the United States, and then you zoom in and then you're in maybe in the Michigan area, and then you zoom in further and the spatial scale is now East Lansing, and you zoom in further, and if you have good enough resolution, maybe we'll get a nice satellite image that shows the Union Building, and we could zoom into sort of finer and finer grained spatial scales. So what I want us to think about right now then is our temporal world, not our spatial world. And the huge, vast range of time scales that exist. So if we were going to, in broad terms, talk about something equivalent to the large spatial scales that I was just mentioning, we could talk about geological time scales, and beginning going back to 700 million years ago and the first invertebrates, to 500 million years ago and the first fishes, to several hundred years ago and the reptiles and amphibians and dinosaurs, and we could keep zooming in until we got to just 0.01 million years ago, which is the time scale of recorded history. So let's zoom in even further and talk about the time scale of the human lifespan, which on average is about 80 years, at least in the US. What happens on the human lifespan? We can identify various milestones. We can talk about birth, developmental milestones if we think about the timescales of change on the human lifespan or the year scale, learning to walk, learning to talk, puberty, educational milestones, employment milestones, relationship milestones, family milestones. We are conscious of changes in our lives, or at least we think we are, and that we notice these changes. But what I want to point out here on a lot of these scales, we don't directly perceive these changes when they happen gradually over time, over years. We don't directly perceive those changes. We notice them over months, over days, over hours, and even minutes. We don't directly perceive those changes. Aging itself is a very slow process. We notice it over time, but we don't see it happen, right? We can speed things up so that we can directly perceive changes, and often people will do that so that you can sort of see the changes of the seasons by stringing together a whole series of snapshots taking over a period of a year. So I want to contrast this change on the scale of years and hours and minutes to what, and zooming in even further, to what Fress referred to as the psychological present. So the time scale of milliseconds to seconds. The time scale where we might, what we might talk about as being perceivable change. So the question here is, how long is a moment? How long is the present? So let's think for a moment about the kinds of changes that we perceive on this scale. So we perceive, certainly we communicate with speech and other forms of communication. Music is on this scale. A good beat in a rock song is probably about 120 beats per minute. So it's going to be about 2 events per second, or 500 milliseconds between beats. We see flashing lights when we're driving in a car. We notice people walking. Walking has a rhythm of about 500 milliseconds between steps. So there's, within this range is when we perceive change. Not recognize that it's happened, but perceive it. If events slow down too much, then events are no longer connected together in time. They're perceived to be isolated events. If events speed up too much, we don't notice them as distinct events, but they become fused in time. This is our temporal world. Okay? And I want us to think for the rest of my brief presentation about how our temporal world impact may provide some insight about issues of brain and mind. So within the psychological present, within the range that we do perceive time and perceive change, perceived time is subject to many distortions. So perceived time can speed up or slow down in different circumstances. It is different for different individuals, and it is similarly hard to get an insight about how what is the nature of those differences in terms of people's temporal experiences. So a couple common expressions highlight sort of this psychological reality. So I'm sure everyone has heard the expression, time flies when you're having fun, or a watch pot never boils. So what these expressions highlight really is the relative nature of people's time perception and the relative nature of the brain's internal clock and the role that attention appears to play. So when we're attending to events in the world, they seem to last longer than when we're not attending to events. So recently in neuroscience, there have been a number of advances that have begun to sort of unravel the neural circuitry underlying time perception. And in this research, one is finding that changes in certainly the level of various neurotransmitters have produced systematic changes in the perception of time. Good example of this is dopamine, where it's been shown that increases in dopamine have a tendency to speed one's internal clock. In this regard, it's not surprising then that a range of different neurological disorders and diseases show deficits or systematic distortions in people's perception of time. I want to turn now to changes that in time perception that occur over the lifespan, which I think has the potential to shape our conscious experience in different ways. We all do not live in the same temporal world, so everyone's temporal experience is different. But there are some interesting, I think, systematic changes that occur across the lifespan. Everyone's probably, if you've been around young children and driving on long trips, going, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet?" And there's, so I want to highlight is one way that different aspects of temporal experience have been measured and looked at across the lifespan. So this is some work that I was involved in a few years ago. So one interesting fact is that individuals have characteristic or preferred tempo. So, so what is considered to be a comfortable speed, or not too fast or not too slow, differs from individual to individual and is quite reliable. But there are some commonalities. So for most adults, comfortable tempo is around 500 or 600 milliseconds, or about, if I were going to tap, it would be about 2 taps a second. And this has been measured in a number of different ways. One is taking a spontaneous motor tempo measure where you ask people to tap at a comfortable rate that's not too fast or too slow. Or you can ask people to listen to different event rates in the world and have them make judgments about whether something is too fast or too slow. So we did this with young children as young as 4 up through adults that were age 90. And what you see is a systematic slowing of preferred tempo across the lifespan. Young children are tuned in to very fast rates. Their comfortable tapping speed and comfortable listening speed is about twice that of young adults. And so their temporal world is sort of shifted to a much faster rate. Whereas adults, young adults and middle-aged adults, it's more in the range of 600 milliseconds, and it gradually starts to slow for older adults. One of the most interesting findings is that there's a relationship between preferred tempo and cognitive decline. So cognitive decline was very strongly associated with the slowing of preferred tempo with increased age. So there are large individual differences, but there are also systematic changes that occur across the lifespan that are related to various cognitive factors. People's temporal experience or their temporal world is also shaped by the pace of their surroundings. So if you live in the Midwest for a long time, then you adapt to the slightly slower pace that exists in the Midwest compared to something like a big city. And so people's sensitivity to what they judge to be too fast or too slow and depends on the pace of their environment. And so we've shown in a series of studies that people adapt to this pace, so that individuals in a very fast environment would judge events that were at a particular rate to be slower than individuals that are in a sort of more slow-paced environment. Finally, I wanted to briefly mention a human ability that some have argued may be unique to humans, and at least not present in all animals, and that is to think back in time and recall the details of our past experiences. So we have this remarkable ability to think back to what we were doing earlier and sort of reinstate previous times in our lives. So I could ask everyone here to think about, what did you have for breakfast this morning, or what were you doing when you woke up? Certainly, our episodic memories are not perfect, but trying to understand how humans accomplish mental time travel poses significant challenges for mechanistic understandings of brain and mind. So what I want to stop with is just, I think, how am I doing on time? 3 minutes. Okay, I think we're in good shape. Is a nice example of anterior grade amnesia. A case of Clive Wearing, who has severe amnesia, but spared actually aspects of his music abilities. He was a composer and conductor. And he only lives in the present. And I think this, and that he has no memory beyond a few seconds. I think this nicely illustrates the importance of sort of our temporal experience and our ability to connect events over time in terms of what makes us uniquely human. Let me see if I can get this to work.
The whole of human society is built around our ability to comprehend time as the past, present, and future. Everything we do, every action, requires that we understand what's just happened and anticipate what will happen next. This understanding is one of the greatest of our human abilities, and we use it continually. I constantly think of the past and the future, but I know that I live in just one time, and that is the present. But the question is, how long does the present last? Perhaps no more than just a fraction of a second. In our mental understanding of the present, perhaps it lasts just long enough for us to hold on to and join our thoughts. But imagine that was all you had, just the sliver of time that is the present, without any memories of the past, nor expectations of the future. What would it mean to have no place in time? One man is consigned to live entirely within the present, with terrible consequences. Clive Wearing has the worst case of amnesia ever known. 20 years ago, he lost his memory, and now his wife, Deborah, is the only person he recognizes.
Clive really only has less than 30 seconds memory. And sometimes it's as little as perhaps 7 seconds. It's as little as a sentence. I'm going to see your sister, Adele. Her daughter's got married recently in New Zealand.
Ah.
And so they're having a party.
Funny how the ladies acquire different title when they get married.
Do you know who I'm going to see tomorrow?
Buckingham Palace.
No, really guess.
I don't know.
You don't know? Adele.
Oh, I see.
Do you know why I'm going?
No.
She's having a party at her house tomorrow.
It's her birthday, isn't it?
No.
Yeah.
Do you know why?
No.
It's to do with her daughter.
Oh, I see.
Do you know why her daughter's having a party?
No.
Guess.
No, I don't.
She's just got married.
Oh, I see.
She just got married.
I'm going to just play just a few seconds of one other little bit, and then we'll stop.
What have you ordered?
I don't know.
It looks like chicken. What's it on?
Salad.
Salad.
Yeah, cooked salad.
Cooked salad.
Since Clive is unaware of anything that's just happened, he perpetually thinks that he has just come round from a lengthy period of unconsciousness.
I've never seen anyone at all. I never heard a word until now. I've never had a dream, even day and night the same, blank. Precisely like death. No thoughts at all. Brain has been inactive and day and night exactly the same. No dreams even.
I think I'll stop there. But one other interesting aspect of his, he keeps a diary or at least a log, because it's and where after each of the entries are, I'm conscious for the very first time, or I'm conscious for, and he's over and over and over again. Each of the entries are very similar. But I think this really highlights the fact that our temporal experience is only a few, and our sort of conscious awareness of the present is only a few seconds. And who we are as humans is a lot about connecting those moments together in time. And that makes us who we are. I want to maybe end by just posing two questions that maybe will come up later. I think two questions that are interesting to think about. They're related. They're flips of the same question. Are to what aspects of our temporal experience are unique to humans, and what aspects of temporal experience are shared with other animals? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Breedlove and Dr. McCauley. And we've had a sense of looking at the brain and that aspect of brain, mind, and soul. And now we're going to shift into some of the other dimensions around what do we think about when we think about the mind, and what does that mean, and what are the connectivities with the soul. And with that, we're going to turn to Dr. Nelson.
Thanks very much. I don't have slides or anything, but I do have a handout. So it'll begin to make its way, no doubt, around the room until it gives out. Probably going to have to ask folks to look on how wonderful it is that so many people showed up. That's great. There's a very long history of people pondering the kinds of questions that bring us here tonight. At least a 2,500-year-old history in the West. Plato was interested in these questions, or questions that have some real similarities to them. So was Aristotle. So were some of the philosophers who are called en blanc, the pre-Socratics. Okay, so for a long time in the West, probably longer than that in other traditions, people have been trying to sort out things like what's the relationship of the parts of human ability, human nature that we think of as psychological, as mental, to other dimensions, other parts of experience, to other parts of the world, the physical parts, for example. How do our mental abilities relate to our bodies, for instance? So there's a long history of folks doing that in philosophy. But of course, there's a long history of people in philosophy trying to figure out not just about what's the nature of mind, but also what's the nature of matter, or what's the nature of living things, or what's the nature of the solar system. In the history of thought, as reliable techniques for making progress on questions like that were developed, okay, after the scientific revolution, philosophy more or less gracefully gave up its pretensions to having anything very much to say about things like biology, or are we not getting anything new? Sorry. Okay. Well, it's a shame if you missed that last bit, because it was really nice. So we'll just hold on. Long history of philosophers thinking about a whole bunch of stuff they don't think about anymore, at least in those ways. We give that over to science. Why shouldn't that be the case now with respect to these kinds of issues, to issues about the character of the mind, its relationship to the body, the relationship of the mental to matter? Why shouldn't we just let science sort of sort that out for us? Well, let's consider this. Science tries, and I think with enormous success in general, to establish the facts of the matter in various domains of reality, and then to try and arrange those facts in powerful explanatory structures, models or theories or laws that range over various domains of the world and that license predictions that are in many cases enormously accurate and sometimes extremely useful and sometimes extremely dangerous as well. But in order to do that well, scientific explanations, like any explanation, need to be clear about the ideas that they're employing in those explanations, needs to be clear about the concepts that are being employed in those explanations, and needs to be clear about the concept of an explanation itself, about what constitutes success in an explanatory endeavor. Now, sometimes that's fairly straightforward stuff. Other times it's not. And I think it's pretty fair to say that it's more or less characteristic of the ideas that sort of that we associate with the notion of the mental, the psychological, that they're complex ideas with some furtive, elusive kind of elements to them, and that can complicate the task of coming up with good explanations of the phenomena in question. Okay. So that's sort of the general form of the sort of apologia that I'm going to try and enter this evening for philosophy still having a role to play in this very old enterprise of trying to get straight about bodies and minds and souls and the relationship among them. But I'm going to stop being sort of programmatic and abstract about this now, and I'm going to try and offer for your amusement, delight, and instruction a series of 7 sort of cautions about what things that people ought to be, in my view, sensitive to when they're thinking about the psychological dimensions of our lives, when they're thinking about the mind. Right, so I call it 7 ways of looking or not looking at minds, brains, and or souls. Okay, so here's the first one. Avoid looking too hard at any single feature of the mind. Okay? This was Descartes' big problem. Okay? He was so impressed. Descartes was a guy who lived around 1596 to 1650, sometime in that period, around the scientific revolution. His big thought was that you had to explain what was most characteristic, most distinctive about human beings by seeing them as a composite of 2 very different types of substances, a spiritual substance and a material substance. The material substance was extended and non-thinking. The spiritual substance was non-extended, meaning it didn't take up any space, it didn't have any physical properties, but it was thinking. It was the repository, the source, the explanation of our thinking abilities. Descartes was so impressed by the interiority of that part of human experience, the mental part, that he forgot to be fully serious about the mind's role in the explanation of physical action and its place in the public world. Right? That was his problem. Okay? So he came up with this theory that we call dualism now, which is a perennial temptation to thought, but a spectacularly hopeless theory, it seems to me, for accounting for human beings. But other thinkers have made structurally similar mistakes. Okay? Descartes was a dualist. Lots of people before and in his time and more so after have been monists, and monists of the materialist stripe. They've thought when it comes to human beings, it's basically matter all the way down, just organized in different ways. One of the ways it's organized is neurologically or neurally, and that's where you look to find the explanation for psychological stuff. Okay? So I think a lot of contemporary neuroscientists probably count, in some sense, at any rate, as materialists. But I think these folks are going to have corresponding problems as they get clearer and clearer about the brain's causal engagement with psychological phenomena. That happens, and I think extremely well, as was illustrated, has been illustrated this evening. But they're going to continue to have a very difficult time in explaining the various subjective features of experience. The hard problem of consciousness that Dr. Breedlove referred to earlier is primarily what I mean by that. Okay, so that's one bit. The second caution, or the second way of looking or not looking, watch out for homunculi. Okay? Now, so what I said earlier sort of suggests that I think that Descartes sort of got it right about the subjective stuff, but not about the other stuff. I don't really think that either, right? It's not really clear that he explained the inner, the interiority, the subjective, the phenomenal character of human experience all that well either. The puzzling things that people do or experience, their perceptual sensitivity to environment, for example, or simply the ability to entertain a thought, okay, have, in some thinkers, including Descartes, I think, been foisted off as occurrences within the person which, so we go from the situation where we're trying to explain perception or the entertainment of a thought as a feature of a whole human being, like the folks sitting in these chairs, by explaining it in terms of some sort of funny abilities that are held by something inside the human being, okay? A little person, maybe, perhaps made out of spirit. But even if it's, but some folks have thought of homunculi as sort of made out of matter. And I was thinking about homunculi when I was watching Dr. Breedlove's slides of the images being created in the brain, thinking, is the thought that there's someone in there looking at those images, is that how we're supposed to explain perception? Well, I mean, surely not, right? I mean, that wouldn't work for a second. It would just reiterate what it is we were trying to explain in the first place. Okay. So talking about tiny people, whether made out of matter or of spirit, doesn't help at all. Okay, so I'm going to move on to 3. Beware of brains that know, remember, feel, communicate, etc. So you might think about the homunculi problem. Well, I mean, that's a dusty old trap that Descartes fell into, maybe, but not contemporary sophisticated thinkers. Contemporary scientists wouldn't make that kind of mistake. But while it's controversial to say this, some people think that a kind of homunculus fallacy does go on sometimes in contemporary thinking about the brain, both by philosophers and by scientists. And a certain amount of what comes out of brain research, for example, suggests that we can identify at least roughly where certain mental states occur, and even tends to speak of brains, or maybe even parts of brains, as experiencing those mental states themselves, right? So one might speak perhaps uncautiously of one part of the brain telling something to another part of the brain. But on reflection, I think this will strike us as pretty odd. I mean, we know what it means to say of a person that she's confused, or that he's puzzled, or that they're alert, or that they're pious, or that they're lustful. But it's far from clear that there's any sense to be made in predicating these kinds of traits of an organ, to say that some human organ is puzzled, or thoughtful, or lustful, or pious, or alert, even if that organ is the gray, wet one between my ears. In fact, it's not clear what it means to say that my belief that Paris is the capital of France is 2 centimeters to the left of my belief that Caracas is the capital of Venezuela. So if some neuroscientific account suggests otherwise, suggests that there is a way of locating and identifying those brain states, or those mental states with brain states, that might be a reason to worry about that account. Okay, so that brings us to 4. Don't just look under the skin, look around the skin. You might think that the careful scientific work that traces out the correlations between brain states and people's thoughts and feelings provides us with just the clarity that's needed, that it establishes new meanings of concepts by extending the common sense use of those concepts. Okay. But I think that's not necessarily so. I think that does happen sometimes, but I don't think that's necessarily so. For example, I think there are certain psychological concepts that we would typically think of as involving our psyches, that if we get clear about how those concepts work in our ordinary lives, we'll see that we need to get clear about more than what goes on in the brain to understand those concepts better. So as a sort of a teaser for this, I'll leave you with a statement that was made by the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. He said at one point, "Love is not a feeling. Love is put to the test. Pain not." Okay. Number 5, don't be fooled by feelings. This brings me to another caution. Some neuroscientists and some philosophers are interested in what are called qualia now. That is, in the subjective feel associated with a given mental episode. Subjectivity is clearly part of what we're trying to get clear about when we're thinking about minds and brains, so that's all to the good. But it seems to me that the example of love that I mentioned a moment ago might provide us with some pause before we identify mental episodes with specific feelings. Another example. We all know what it's like to be angry. But it seems possible on reflection. I mean, we might say being angry, that's a very distinct kind of feeling, a qualia in technical terms. Maybe we could just get clear about what that feeling is, what part of the brain lights up, we'll know what anger is. But it also seems possible that we might discover that we have been angry and that we haven't known it at the time. Right? Now, this suggests that mental states are not, at least uniformly, to be identified with their qualia. Maybe love or anger, or even whether you're wishing or hoping, is a matter of things that go on in your brain, plus things that go on outside of you, in your social situation, for example. Okay, one more. Our language about the mind is awash in metaphors, and we have to pay attention to them. For example, one talks of currents of thought, or as Wallace Stevens did, of being of 3 minds. Now, some of this type of metaphoric language might be translatable into nice literal prose that names clearly defined states of mind that could plausibly be identified with distinct processes in the brain. But it isn't clear that such translations from the metaphorical to the literal are always available to us, nor is it clear that there's one kind of discourse, metaphoric or literal, that expresses mental states as everyone feels them. There's some fiction by South African writer named Miriam Thaler, a novel of hers called Between Two Worlds, in which she talks of a feeling that she calls white master's well-fed dog feeling, which she gets sometimes in her interactions with white people in South Africa. It's not clear to me that she means that to be a sort of amalgam of other feelings or something that could easily be translated into some other feeling. That might be a distinct feeling, and it might emerge in distinct conditions, social conditions. So it's not clear if we're really alert to the sort of canonical set of things we need to get cleared about, whether the emotions as we tend to think of them in our situation are just what the emotions are. Okay, so I said that was the last one, but I forgot about the soul. But I'm not going to say anything about the soul because we've got Arthur next who's going to say about the soul. So all I'm going to say is when you're thinking about souls, you might remember Wittgenstein's dictum, another one of his, the human body is the best picture of the human soul. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson, and he still may tell us about the soul when we get into question and answer period.
I'm Arthur Versluis. I'm chair of religious studies, and I've got a couple of things that I wanted to start with. Really, I have 3 things to talk about here today, and I'm going to keep it fairly brief. In terms of religious studies, I wanted to start by just mentioning that for us now what is this? What did you do exactly? For us in religious studies, the Department of Religious Studies, this is really quite an exciting time. And that's also true on a national level, and I want to explain why that is. And it has much to do with the conversation that has developed here. And it is something of a conversation. And it concerns the study of religion. But when I mentioned that I'm from I'm the chair of the Department of Religious Studies. Occasionally people think, well, what, is MSU have a theological wing? Is there a, is this based somehow in confessional religion? So I thought I'd start by just saying that no. It's actually the academic study of religion as phenomena. And religion and its cultural force, the way it shapes the way we think. And so I need to say that at the front, because there's still some confusion about that apparently. Now, secondly, what I want to say is that there's also confusion about a lot of terminology. And that's true. People tend in the area of religion to take for granted particular terms and concepts. And this is true both for people who see themselves as religious and people who also see themselves as in some way possibly atheist or anti-religious. And actually what's developed is a kind of bifurcation of the debate, a kind of back and forth that leaves out a great deal. What does this have to do with the academic study of religion? The academic study of religion means that you think about different religions. You come to understand in a broader way the range of religious phenomena. But the public debate in this country, and the Pew poll that came out in 2010 only amplifies this. It was a national poll. And it turned out that many people who see themselves as religious actually don't know much about their own religion, and they know nothing about other religions. And that's broadly speaking true. It turns out atheists know the most. And the reason they know the most is they know a lot about what they don't like. So they have oftentimes there's like a bogeyman. And so they know a lot about the bogeyman, whatever that is, but not about other religions. And you see that. And I'll talk about that briefly in a moment. But that's my first point, is religious studies is the academic study of religion. And that has a function in the society that I think is important. More important maybe even in the past. Second thing I want to say is that we don't, in religious studies, countenance a confessional approach. In other words, it's an academic set of way of studying. And part of it, and this is my own background, is historical. I tend to look at areas of religion that are historically marginalized or understudied. I study things that other people don't study. I find that extremely interesting. When I go back and look at the history of this term soul and the way people tend to use the word soul in defining what it means to be human, they tend to think that they have an understanding of what that means. And this is in the tradition of this entire panel, that each time somebody talked about something up here, it turns out that, guess what? The thing that you assume to be true, the brain or the self, identity or time, or philosophical concepts are not necessarily. And so here I am in this august tradition to tell you that the same is true in terms of religion. That is to say, much of the public discussion actually is rather unclear, and the terminology is unclear. We're not quite sure what we mean when we use the word or a term like soul. Oftentimes that's the case. You can go back historically to Plato and to the Platonic tradition, and there's a tradition there of psyche, or in Latin anima, this idea of non-physical consciousness. And I think that's really a core idea here, that consciousness can have a continuity out and is not outside the body, and that it is not, consciousness is not only epiphenomena of material, right? It's not a material phenomenon alone. That is a term that that is a way of defining what you could call soul, right? But even that becomes somewhat problematic when you start looking at some examples that I have here. You can look at the Platonic tradition itself, and if you look at this concept of soul as subtle body, or as a vehicle of light, sometimes it's called. It's assumed that one can look at that tradition and find something solid there, but actually it breaks down the closer you look at it. And if you go outside the Western Platonic or Christian tradition and you look at other religions, what you discover, for example, in Buddhism, is that Buddhism defines itself by the idea that there really is, it's anatman, which means no, ultimately translated as no self. That the core insight of Buddhism is that there is continuity of consciousness, but there is no core self. There's no permanent or lasting or enduring identity. So what I'm saying is that there's a range of different ways of understanding in the West, right, historically, and then more broadly across different religious traditions. And so when you have somebody like Richard Dawkins, who's a new atheist, he is creating a straw man in some of his arguments and ignoring some of the things that I've just alluded to here. The complexity of the Platonic tradition and also non-Western or non-monotheistic religious traditions. So a lot of the public discussion tends to drop those things out. The third thing I want to briefly mention here is, and this is for me the most exciting thing, is contemporary research into consciousness and the kinds of things that now are being discovered through cognitive science and through neuroscience and the way that intersects with the study of religion. Because soul, a kind of nebulous term like soul, one can also use a term like consciousness and start looking at different states of consciousness and continuity of consciousness. Think about it that way. And I think religious studies has not yet caught up with the science. Last year, there was the largest national conference in the study of religion, largest international conferences in the United States. It's the American Academy of Religion. There were about 1,500 papers, and I did a survey, and I could only find 5 that even referred to neuroscience, and I think that's quite shocking. I find it exciting that there's so much research going on, and I want to talk about a couple things I find particularly so. But some of the literature, and this is also true both of religious studies and of philosophy, some of the literature in both religious studies and in philosophy tends to drop out or ignore some of the research that's inconvenient about mysticism, alternate states of consciousness, non-dual states of consciousness, things that maybe are inconvenient for contemporary models or maybe step on the feet of someone's particular preconceptions, but actually are extremely interesting in terms of thinking in new and broader ways, and that's why I find what's happening so exciting. There are 2 assumptions that I want to mention in terms of problematic areas in the study of consciousness. One is the assumption that only what I would call discursive reason or a discursive form of consciousness is the only form of consciousness. In a lot of the literature, and I've done a small survey of this because of a project I'm working on right now, I found that in a lot of literature on consciousness, you tend to, and this is quite surprising, and also in the area of what's called neurophilosophy, you find that only a discursive kind of consciousness is considered real. This very narrow kind of logical consciousness and other forms of consciousness, non-dual forms, there's a whole range of them, are kind of excluded. And mysticism doesn't even appear in the index in many of these. Mysticism, broadly defined, I would describe it as some form of non-dual consciousness. Second area, kind of problem area, the sense that a self is an enduring entity and that personal immortality is really the only way to think about consciousness. In other words, that there is an individual who is somehow going to be permanent, that's a long-term or enduring or even permanent. Both of those assumptions are actually very limited ways of thinking about these areas that we're talking about, the study of really the intersection of science and religion. So what I'm suggesting here is that neuroscience is actually, and it's inconvenient sometimes. The chair of the head of the American Academy of Religion last year published a book, and she directly dismissed neuroscientific research into mysticism in the brain as problematic. And she did so because it took seriously the possibility of self-other transcendence as possibly visible in fMRI brain scans, that you can possibly see this. I'm not saying you can. I'm saying that there's interesting things going on in terms of consciousness, and I'm saying that actually this model that she's working from doesn't actually excludes in some ways some of this research. And I think that's a serious issue. So what I'm suggesting is that some of these areas need to be reevaluated, and I find it extremely exciting. Patrick McNamara, who's a neuroscience at Boston University, just came out with I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. He just came out with a 2-volume series. Just came out. I mean, it's like brand new. And it's on possession. Possession. The history of demonic possession, spirit possession, God's possessing you. And he moves through a whole series of different historical phenomena. The scale of this 2-volume series is startling, to say the least, to me, as a scholar of religion. It's very ambitious. But what he's effectively doing is trying to think historically and in terms of the study of religion about this phenomena, which is widespread, of people being possessed by a god, by a spirit, demonic possession. What is this? What does it mean? If it doesn't exist in the modern world in the same way, does it manifest in other ways? He's asking broad cultural questions. And I think that that's really, as I said, a kind of fusion in some ways of science. Now, I'm not endorsing everything about Patrick McNamara. I'm saying that I find it extremely challenging and ambitious as a work. And I'm suggesting that this connection between science and religion and the way that the two have crossed over, this intersection is actually, we are on the cusp of thinking about things in very new ways as a result of this research. And I think some of these things are going to be disturbing for people in different ways, possibly, or shake up the way people think about things, and I see that as very positive in a long-term way. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you to all of our panelists, and I have to say hats off to them. When we sat down to kind of talk about what we might focus on, as you can see, the topic is very broad, and it really was a free-flowing conversation and one person to the next in terms of how it all connected. And as I sat here listening today, some themes that cut across that I think we still don't have a consistency in terminology, and we all might challenge, is perception of time. And what does that really mean across the different spheres in terms of the brain, the mind, the soul? And we focus on the soul. How do we bring in spirituality and the study of religion? Also free will. What does that mean across these different areas? And consciousness. I mean, so even in looking at these different areas, we still have these concepts that in any one field we take as a given, even though we debate the meanings. And as we begin to talk across the fields, we see, well, what does it really mean to have free will? What does that come down to? And if you don't have enough questions, we'll pose that to the panelists. But one of the things we wanted to do was make sure you had an opportunity to engage the panelists. So we're going to pause for a moment and get one of the mics and go around the room and allow you to ask questions. And when there's lulls, we'll let the panelists ask each other questions, and there's some that I can throw to them. But hopefully you believe that this is the beginning of a dialogue. We hope that when you leave here this evening that you continue to have these conversations, and you also seek out the panelists to continue these conversations. So we're going to open the floor to you to see if you would like to put a question.
Okay. I want to apologize ahead of time just because of the length of this question, but I think it covers a lot of ground. In probing the depths of who we are as human beings, both in states of conscious alertness and unconscious influence, can the self be described as a synthesis of the downward causal influence of spiritual substance and the upward causal disposition of material substance? And if so, are the implications of the role of spirituality in the scientifically dominated paradigm today, we find ourselves in today? So what are the implications of the role of spirituality in the scientifically dominated paradigm we find ourselves in today?
Does someone want part A of that question?
Terminological observation, which is some people in the study of religion absolutely hate the word spirituality. They find it nebulous. They think religion is a particular social phenomenon, and that the word spirituality is used in a way that's vague. I don't share that. I tend to think of spirituality as a useful term because it has to do with practice and with aspects of religion that maybe are not quite the same as the word religion, that there is a distinction between the two. So that's just a terminological. As to the rest of your question, I really wasn't quite clear on the distinction you were making.
Can the self be described? Testing? Okay, cool. Can the self be described as a synthesis of the downward causal influence of spiritual? And spiritual, I kind of, in using that term, I'm referring to the highly intimate and individualistic experience of that-ness, I suppose, that transcendentness that can't really put your finger on. But yet it's still historically noted, and people experience it time in and time out. Can the synthesis between that aspect of our experience and the upward causal disposition of our being describe ourself? How do the two mingle together?
I'm absolutely sure that I don't know. And I think those are exactly the issues that everyone in the field is grappling with. And if we had an answer, we would have presented it to you. But those are big questions.
Yeah, and you said can, and so in that sense, one could say yes.
I actually had a question, I guess primarily for Professor Macaulay, but hopefully it'll expand out. It seemed like one of the places where we saw connections was around this experience of time. And the larger question of whether consciousness can be imagined as discursive, right, be it putting together temporal experiences in a sort of narrative form. And I guess my question for you was whether you thought that, you were talking primarily about the sort of relativity of time sense in external rhythms, right? The tapping, the experience of music, the tempo. And I was wondering, when you started to talk about dopamine, and I assume sort of dopamine and norepinephrine, that you're also potentially talking about external experiences of mind time. In other words, the experience of believing that you're thinking too fast or thinking too slowly, and whether or not you believe that kind of rhythm, right, actually can be talked about in terms of perhaps getting closer to the qualia, right, that is being discussed as the sort of big problem, and maybe also to the final speaker's question about this problem of seeing consciousness as essentially sort of discursive.
So I do, so there are different views about how sort of the brain keeps time. One view is that there's a clearer separation between sort of mind time and the external world. So that you have some kind of internal clock which might be, which the speed of which may change depending on the levels of various neurotransmitters. So it can speed up or slow down. But that's and that passively sort of measures the duration of events in the world. The other view has a closer sort of coupling between sort of the brain. There are lots of endogenous oscillations in the brain which may interact with sort of the rhythms that are in the environment and result in this coupling, so that we're entrained by the rhythms. We certainly know that circadian rhythms are entrained by the light-dark cycle and various sort of time-giving cues in the environment on sort of the circadian time scale. But we're also certainly entrained by rhythms that occur within what I was referring to as the psychological presence. So there's a close coupling between sort of mind time or mind oscillations and sort of rhythms in the environment. And that I see them as sort of connected. Sure.
I have a very specific question for Professor Macaulay about Clive Waring. He speaks very fluently. is he remembering words?
So I think what you're nicely highlighting is a difference between semantic memory, sort of people's sort of long-term knowledge, which they may not, so they know words and he can speak language, but versus ability to remember sort of and form specific episodic memories of one's past. So I can know certain facts about my life. So I can know that I graduated from high school, and I can, but I may not remember the specific episodic details of going through the graduations. I may remember some, but some of those details are gone. And I think one of the interesting questions is sort of the nature of how we develop this long-term knowledge, because clearly it has to be formed initially from these episodic experiences, but it may get abstracted from those details that we then lose. And what Clive Wearing has lost is the ability to form those new episodic memories and episodic memories from his past. So I hope that maybe gets at part of your question, but I think other people on the panel will have other thoughts on this.
Well, I mean, it's simply that, I mean, that what Dr. McCauley referred to, this fact that episodic memory can be separated from semantic memory, is something we only learned in the 20th century, and that people did not predict, and it was the presence of people like that really brought it home, that they must be quite different. So, you know, or the famous patient, HM, Henry Mollison, who died just a few years ago, who, if you gave him an IQ test, you know, he still scored, you know, sort of high normal range, but he couldn't have a life because he couldn't remember having anything that happened more than, you know, 15 seconds, 2 minutes ago. And so he couldn't string together a life, and that was a big surprise that memory was organized those two different ways. Plato didn't, as far as I know, did not anticipate that. But
could I just speak to that briefly? I mean, I think this is a fascinating question, particularly when we reflect on the amount that one has to know and remember in order to use language with the facility that this gentleman uses it, and also that the fact that there's, I mean, to talk about it as semantic memory might slight certain other features of Mr. Waring's memory that seem to be operative, maybe because of their connection with language. But, for example, his sense of his self, it's not as though he rediscovers who he is every 7 seconds, I take it. I mean, and the fact that he remembers his wife, that's fascinating. There was, maybe some of you saw the piece in the New Yorker, I guess 2 weeks ago, about the philosopher Derek Parfit, who's written a great deal about the mind and ethics and the relationship between the two as they affect the notion of the self recently, who I guess recently had an episode of fairly significant amnesia in which about all he could remember was who Janet Radcliffe Richards is, that is to say, the love of his life, his wife. That was poignant and strange.
So is he drawing on residual? I mean, it's a factual question.
The declarative memory, things that he can tell you that he knows, it seems to be intact, and that's what's so strange for us. And the musical ability, you saw him. I mean, he still knows how to play the piano. I mean, it's.
And I think what's interesting,
it's not the way we think of ourselves as it being possible to be parceled out that way, and yet sometimes we are.
I think what's interesting about the musical ability also is the fact that he is sort of stringing together, being able to perform these extended temporal sequences and connect these together in time, but yet he can't do that in other aspects of his life at all.
Do you know whether he can only play from a score right now? Can he remember, as it were, scores that he's memorized in the past?
That I don't know. I have seen videos of him also conducting still some in a small group, so he's able to almost multitask too as well in terms of his musical capabilities, which is quite remarkable given how impaired he is otherwise.
I think we had 2 or 3 questions.
For those of you do raise your hands, and we'll work our way back to the front, because we've got the mic in the back now. So do raise them each as the questions come
I've got Parkinson's disease. Now, the position that you are espousing, do they ever get entangled with something like Parkinson's or some of the other neurological
So I
disorders?
Is this question, I didn't know if this was directed to me, because we were just talking earlier
It could be
about
directed to anybody up there, because it seems that whatever you're engaged in with something like Parkinson's disease, your ability to direct yourself to control what you do and how much you can do and how much you can remember and how you relate is very much affected by the disorder. So essentially, anything that you set up there, Parkinson's disease could bear upon.
I think one of the interesting observations related to Parkinson's is some of the changes in temporal experience. So and the role that external rhythms in the environment can potentially play to actually in a therapeutic sense. So in terms of it seems like there's some evidence of sort of not just having motor impairments, but also perceptual impairments that relate to the internal generation of rhythms. And so providing rhythmic structure in the environment can often be very helpful. There are a number of instances of this, and so music actually can result in fluid movement in instances where that's not generally possible. So I think there's one interesting question is the role that temporal structure in the environment may play in sort of playing the role of dopamine in the sense of enabling the internal generation of movements or rhythms.
One of the things that strikes me as so fascinating about that is that it's brain problems, brain lesions, I think, that was one of the important influences that made thinkers begin to focus on the brain as having a special causal role in the mental. But at the same time, the point about the way in which the environment outside the skull can be structured in a way to sort of scaffold or to take over features that are causally mediated typically by the brain. I think that's fascinating, and it suggests a way in which sometimes it can be useful in explaining characteristic things about human beings to look outside. I mean, mentalistic things to look outside the brain and into the world in which the brain exists.
Now I'm actually going to take an organizer's prerogative and ask a question and then hand it back to Joyce. The one thing that hasn't come up yet, because you've talked about memory in the past, you haven't talked about our perception of the future. So our ability to imagine a future, or I imagine that in neuroscience and in cognitive science, the ability to predict the next thing that's going to come up on a screen, or other things like that. So could you talk a little bit, because the future plays very much into religion. It plays very much to a degree in philosophy. And could you talk a little bit about that whole notion of future sense and whether or not that's one thing that really helps us locate the human?
Well, I mean, I'm happy to take a first stab at that. I mean, it's, you know, this mysterious thing that we have going on inside our heads, or at least I have inside of mine, I think you have inside of yours, this feeling that I'm here and that I'm present and I'm paying attention, you know, that I'm the little man inside my head, paying attention to the sensory input, et cetera, that's such a strong feeling. To my mind, as to date, the best explanation for why we do this is the one that Roger Sperry, who pioneered those split brain, which was to suggest that in the course of natural selection, once our heads got big enough, it became useful to, in our mind's eye, imagine what would happen if I were to step on that teeter-totter, or if I were to, you know, step off the teeter-totter when someone's at the other end. I mean, that ability to sort of watch events play out like a Rube Goldberg cartoon, if anybody remembers what those are, that natural selection favored the development of consciousness in order for us to think about the future and to predict the future. And if that is so, how will we ever know? I mean, I do worry that this little slice of our mind, we know it's a tiny part of our mind, this part of our mind that we're aware of, and that we're having our little, monologues in all the time as we observe the world and approve and disapprove of what's going on. I mean, you really wonder if that's the cause of a lot of trouble. I mean, I think it's that experience that has always made people think about something permanent inside there, right? And makes people think that there's a soul. I mean, here I am, I'm thinking and I'm looking at the world and I'm figuring stuff out, and I get, I think I get, a little bit smarter every year. Really, this is going to come to an end? I went to all this trouble, and one day I will be no more? I mean, that's really very shaking, and it's contradictory to the experience of it. And so I think. Anyway, so I think if that natural selection may have given us, a two-edged, let's say, a gift that has both benefits and disadvantages.
So I'm going to push this one a little further to go to the religion and philosophy side and see if I can't draw the panelists in. Some might also argue that aside from natural selection, there's a belief that there's something beyond this life. And because there's something beyond this consciousness, there's an obligation to live one's life a certain way. And how do we take that concept of the future into play as we're going through our daily life? I can't draw you in?
Well, there's two things that I could mention. One is kind of the teleological push, the push toward a kind of envisioned future, sometimes seen as a millennium or as a point in time ahead of us, or something in time, but it's ahead. That's distinct from what I was talking about, which is an experience of subject-object unity. That's timelessness or transcendence. And I'm distinguishing between the two because what I'm really interested in terms of my own research and just one of my primary interests is this kind of subject-object unity experience, which is also an experience of timelessness. You could also call that the eternal, but that's different than, that is different than an indefinite postponing or an expectation or a looking forward to something else that's still in time. Do you see what I'm saying, the distinction? So I'm separating those two out to some extent because I think that might make things clearer.
And
or
so
muddy them more, I don't know.
If you went with the unity, that there is an eternal, where would you take this for that future?
Well, if you're talking about something that's an experience that's timeless, then present is all one has, in some sense.
All right, there were additional questions. I lost my mic circulator.
So
Okay.
I also have a question for you. So Dr. Breedlove just said that, made a comment about how we talk to ourselves and we find this end shaking. The Western world's very individualistic. It's evidenced in our religions. And I was wondering, how much is that true across human experience as you find it in religion? Is that true in the Eastern experience, that they find the individual end as shaking? Do they, I guess, yeah, that's my question.
Are you asking, do different religious traditions encourage a sense of selflessness? As opposed selflessness as opposed to individual? Are you talking about a distinction between ego and selflessness, or what exactly are you asking about?
Maybe the different ways of coping with the end in our Western tradition. We think of our souls as continuing, at least in the Christian tradition, and other religions cope with the end, as it were, in different ways. And I was wondering if you could expound upon that. and I'm
Not in any great detail,
okay.
because it would be a course, you know. It would be but there are different ways of understanding soul or self in the West, and also in let alone in Asian religious traditions like Buddhism, where the core idea is no self, ultimately no self.
I wanted to get back to the first question, the top-down, bottom-up, and both of you, or many of you, referred exclusively to Plato. Aristotle settled it the other way, that the soul was the form of the body, and the soul didn't exist without the body. Unfortunately, from the Christian point of view, at least in those days, when the body dies, the soul dies as well. That's why Plato was dominant until Aquinas came around and restored Aristotle to Western tradition, where the soul is essentially part of the substance, not two separate substances. So Descartes was a Platonist in a sense, but whereas modern science developed because of the Aristotelian separation of science, knowledge, from theology, which was related to Plato because he believed in the soul as a separate thing. Whereas Aristotle, the soul was essentially part of the substance. It was only the holomorphic thing. So that's the answer to his first question. The soul is...
Thank you. See, I knew I didn't know that.
But, you know, that's just the way I learned philosophy, from Aristotle first.
I'd like to talk about motivation, and I just spent the weekend with a 2-year-old who was always exploring and experimenting.
Very quickly, too, I imagine.
Yeah, and yet I wrote a computer program that's capable of doing much more than this 2-year-old, but has not had the tendency to go out and explore the rest of the hard disk and find out what else is there. Where is this motivation, this desire to explore, and what are the prospects for embedding that in machine intelligence?
That was one of the topics we threw out that everyone was kind of like, okay, where might this go? So.
I mean, I think to start, one might begin to look at sort of basic approach and avoidance systems, and as a vehicle for providing ways, different. So this makes me think of certainly some work on motivation, linking approach and avoidance to different motivational orientations that people have for different tasks. So people can approach tasks with a promotion orientation where they're trying to achieve a particular goal, or a prevention orientation where they're trying to prevent loss. And I think trying to ground these in very sort of basic approach and avoidance systems would be one way to start. Now, I have no idea how you're going to, how to sort of work that into sort of machine systems. But I think one of the keys is trying to understand sort of very primitive and low-level motivational systems and how they may give rise to complex behaviors that, actually going back to one of Dr. Breedlove's point, that may, in some case, we come up with sort of explanations for what we do, but which may not reflect actually why we do them, so that the free will part comes post hoc, or that as an explanation as opposed to the underlying motivation.
Here's a guess about that, for what it's worth. It would be meaningless if I talked about the curiosity or the motivation to do anything of this. Water. Pitcher, thank you. There are lots of cognitive problems up here on this. Right, so, and I think that even if it were a much more impressive looking machine, it would be equally meaningless. It's probably going to have to do something, right? Move around, have some behaviors to it, right? Which suggests to me that part of what's involved in a lot of the psychological descriptions that we make of other human beings, and in the scenario that you're envisaging of non-human beings, of non-animate beings, involves not just the internal circuitry, but how it manifests itself in action in the world or behavior in the world. So I think they're going to have to sniff around before they start really being the proper subjects of predicates like is curious or is motivated or wonders whether, seeks out.
And actually, I want to second that same point of view, and I'll take it back in terms of natural selection. Why do they work so hard to eat or to drink or to have sex? I mean, why do they have those motivations? Because natural selection favored organisms that arose that behaved in those ways. And I don't know that natural selection particularly cared what experience they had inside, as long as when they were pursuing those goals, as long as they pursued those goals. And those individuals that did not pursue those goals, those individuals who were, when they were 2-year-old, were not actively finding out as much as they could about the environment so they could survive, they didn't leave any offspring. And so I think in fact, it'd be very hard for those things to arise unless you had some agent that was interacting in some way with the world. I guess I'm not entirely sure that it would have to be a robot of a particular size or something, but it would have to interact in some way with the world, and then there'd have to be something to favor the development of those things, but those motivations. But could that happen in an individual machine at a particular time, or would it require millions of generations? And who's going to, you're not going to get a grant from NIH to do that. I mean, they're not, they hate to give you a 5-year grant, much less. It's a, and so I'm dubious about whether it can happen without some sort of agency involved, just as you say.
So you're talking about a longitudinal study of my blender, is what you're talking. Okay, other questions on this side? Well, it's all over there. This is an exercise program for organizers. I just want you to understand that. Okay, who's over here with a question? Oh, you already had one.
In terms of artificial intelligence, I've heard just studies and theories that eventually once an AI program has enough knowledge, or it's knowledgeable enough, that consciousness will just arise. So what do you guys think about that theory? Is that a likely explanation? Is there a better one? Or
I mean, I think in some ways, I think that's unlikely. Because, I mean, one could imagine where you just, have a computer program where you keep, inputting more and more knowledge. And so there's nothing fundamentally that's changing because of having more and more knowledge. You can imagine then that certainly you could imagine that you had a computer program that was able to, I think the classic example is, be able to translate from one language to another by manipulating a whole series of symbols. And I don't think one would say then that this machine then is conscious, right? And just because it can do these operations and has a certain sort of size of knowledge or a certain amount of knowledge. So I think this gets at the hard problem also of consciousness, which we aren't close to having a handle on, I think.
Hi. It sounds like these were all presentations that were somewhat separate from your individual fields. Is there, aside from this presentation, is there an ongoing collaboration to continue this discussion, to answer these questions within the university?
There is actually. Religious Studies in the last about year and a half has had a series called Beyond the Polemic, Science and Religion, and we've been making a concerted effort to reach out in order to encourage interdisciplinary discussion. So the answer in that particular area is yes, but I think this broadly, this indicates this Honors College initiative indicates that conversation. It indicates something that is going on both in public events but also behind the scenes.
One thing I would add there is I think with certainly the answer is at one level yes, and that there are I think just the nature of some of the advances in neuroscience that allow us to start to answer some questions about, as Mark was mentioning, about human consciousness, now that we have non-invasive neuroimaging technologies, I think that's inherently increased interdisciplinary interactions. And in terms of an ongoing conversation, one of the things I did want to sort of call people's attention to is that the Cognitive Science program does have a Distinguished Speaker Series, which brings in speakers from a variety of backgrounds that discuss topics related to brain and mind. And one of the speakers that's coming in next in the spring is Adrian Owen, who's done a lot of very interesting work recently on persistent vegetative state and disordered states of consciousness and using neuroimaging technology.
We had another question in the back.
Yeah. How important is consciousness? You know, there's a lot of what you've been talking about, and it implies that the consciousness is sort of an afterthought, if I can use that. Sort of irony there, but how important is it?
To whom? Mine's important to me.
Well, it is to you. It's not to me, Jim. No. Is it the tip of the iceberg? Is the consciousness that 10% that's above the water, whereas 90% of what's really going on mentally is not conscious for us? And it seems to me the consciousness at times is not only is actually unhelpful rather than helpful. So how important is it?
Yeah, please.
Well, I don't know. I'm sure that, so I'll say that first. But I mean, you probably all of you have had the experience at one time or other when, so when I've had minor surgery and had anesthesia, I will eventually learn that I was awake and talking before I remember being awake and talking. And so I don't know, I mean, and yet I seem to have a coherent conversation and, you know, I wasn't there. Is it that I wasn't there, or is it that I was there and I don't remember, and therefore what's the difference if I don't remember anyway, right? If I have no continuous connection to that me that was talking to the nurse in recovery, right, and talking about those things. And I had a student who emailed me when she was in recovery, it was her mother who later told her that she told the nurse and her mother about these things I had said in class that day. She thought it was but she had no recollection of it, et cetera. So is it that she was talking and working without being conscious? I don't know, because it could be that she was conscious at the time and doesn't remember, right? Those drugs are great amnestic agents too. But at least it's possible, I suppose, that I wasn't conscious there for a while and I seemed to do okay. And so I don't know if I need consciousness. Except that I like mine at least as well as Jim likes his. So.
Yeah.
I don't want to give it up.
I actually like Scott's. I mean, I think the world would be a poorer place without it. So, I mean, I think it really is a question of important for what. You know, as an explanatory, if you're asking what kind of explanatory role does it play, that's one thing. It may be less than people have thought. But that may not be the only respect in which people have thought that consciousness is a deeply important feature of human experience, and not the only reason why it would be really interesting if we get a better handle on it.
Well, if we haven't answered all your questions, we've done exactly what we set out to do. We wanted to start the dialogue, hopefully encourage you to continue these types of discussions, to follow up with the panelists. We want to make sure you have time that if you want to approach the panelists individually, you can do so. And we also are going to ask a favor of you. We're going to ask you to be part of our network to get the word out. So the next Sharper Focus, Wider Lens forum will be held on November 21st, Understanding Genocide Across Time and Space. And we will have Dr. Laura A. Paul, Christine DeJong, and I have to apologize in advance if I'm murdering anyone's name, Dr. Elizabeth Drexler and Dr. Ken Waltzer as our panelists. And we're really looking forward to that conversation and invite you back and invite you to invite others. And we have some flyers that you can take with as reminders or pass them on to others. And we thank you for joining us in this discussion tonight. And the panelists will be here for a couple minutes if you have questions for them.